So we're going to start off by looking at the factors of production, and we're going to briefly just look at land as a factor of production. As I said to you before, we're going to focus predominantly on labour, but we just want to have a look at some key terms in relation to factors of production and a little bit about land. Okay, so first of all we want to look at some key definitions. The first one here is what's called the goods market. You guys are very familiar with the goods market. The goods market are markets in which companies and households interact to buy and sell goods and services. So if we're looking here at my example of vegetables. So we know the market is the likes of Tesco. We could also have Dunnes. We could have some grocery shops. And that is how, and in some cases farmer markets as well. And that is how our consumers, so these guys here, avail of the product. So that's what we call our goods market. They're the markets in which companies and households interact to buy and sell goods and services. So we know that in the goods market as well, the likes of Tesco and Dunnes and grocery shops, they will buy these vegetables from in the market, which that market may be from farmers themselves. The second thing we have here is factor markets, and this is what we're really going to be focusing on in this chapter. Factor markets are markets where factors of production are bought and sold. These factors have input into the final product sold in the goods market, and the factors that we're most interested in is land, labour and capital. So you'll often have heard the term the labour market. You'll often have heard the term the market for land or the demand for land, and we're going to look a little bit at that today. And what we know is that farmers provide their labour and their land, and they do so to produce goods like vegetables for the goods market. But their labour and their land comes at a cost, and normally that cost is factored into the price of vegetables. On that note, one other definition that we need to know is the definition of derived demand. So demand that is not for the factor itself, but for what it can contribute to the production process. So for example, when we look at the demand for land today, it is not because of how pretty it looks, but for what it can be used for. So for example, to build houses or factories on it. Another example would be the demand for wood. It relates to what it can be used for. So maybe to make a table. It's not for the actual product itself. We also see that in relation to labour. So the demand for labour, demand for people, workers, is not for the person themselves, but for what they can actually produce. So let's look at land then. Land is anything supplied by nature which helps in the production of output. The example there would be fertile land allows for agriculture, so agriculture or farming. And we know that we also can get natural resources as well, such as fossil fuels. We can get water that comes from land, and we use water, so anything that is supplied by nature itself. Some key features of land as a factor of production. So the first one is we know it's fixed in supply, and we definitely know that in Ireland, seeing as we're a very small island. So it's fixed in supply, eventually it will run out. The earnings of land are economic rent. So we're going to talk about economic rent in a second. It has no cost of production. It's been provided to us by nature. It is a non-specific factor of production. Means that it's not confined to one specific use. So for example, with land we can use it for housing, we can use it for recreational, so things like parks, playgrounds. We can use it for commercial, so things like buildings, factories and so on. And the price of land does not affect the quantity available. So that's really important. We know that in some areas of Dublin, the price of land will be much, much higher than other areas. And also then the price of land in Dublin will be way higher than, let's say, for example, Leitrim. Okay, so just another key term that came up there, economic rent. So economic rent is when there is any earning of a factor of production above its supply price or its transfer earnings. So we know that land has no supply price. It's something that was given to us by nature, and it was there when the first humans arrived. So therefore there is no price as such. Transfer earnings of a factor production is the earning of a factor in its next best alternative employment. So that's just the definition of transfer earnings. And when we talk about supply price, it's the minimum payment necessary to bring a factor into use and maintain it in that particular use. So we look at Ronaldo here. So Ronaldo's yearly salary in 2019 was 35 million. If Ronaldo had have become an accountant instead, so maybe let's say for example he was qualified to become an accountant but actually became a top footballer. Well, an accountant's salary would be €40,000 per year, roughly, per year. So we can see there's a large economic rent there. If we look at the case of land, a 3-bed house in Dublin would cost maybe €460,000, depending on what area in Dublin it is, versus Leitrim where it's €210,000. And it might be the same square patch of land, like the same size that is needed to build either house, but obviously it's much more expensive in Dublin, and that's economic rent. Now, also on that, I suppose, is that we could look at how both of these areas of land could have been used for agriculture instead. But we know that would actually, it would receive much less money than if you're to sell a house on that small patch of land for €460,000. So just on that, a couple of ways a factor production can earn economic rent. So the first thing being a shortage in the supply of any factor production. So if land or labour is short in supply, its price will increase, and we definitely see that in Dublin. We also see it in jobs where there is a shortage in labour. So for example, in some IT firms in Dublin, there's a huge shortage at the minute for IT workers, and therefore their salaries are much, much higher. The possession of a rare skill or talent. So if a person has a skill which is in great demand, and in our example we have Ronaldo, they can demand much higher money. And then finally, the rent of ability. An entrepreneur who invents a much sought after commodity may command high income. Example being Bill Gates, who came up with Windows, or you have Steve Jobs, who invented Apple. So if we're to look at the demand curve for land, so you'll see here I've drawn out my curve. I have written my price and quantity on my X and Y axis. And then I have this quantity supplied, because we know that quantity supplied, that's one thing that we know from our characteristics at the beginning. It's fixed in supply. So our demand could be anywhere depending on the demand, what the demand, the level of demand is. So let's look at if it is this here, which we'll call D1. So at D1 we can see that there is a fixed quantity supply, and the demand crosses the curve here at this point here, and at this point here we get this price P1. Now if we see an increase in demand for land, so what we're going to see then is an increase in demand for land. That's going to shift the curve to the right, as you remember from our study of demand and supply. So when it shifts the curve to the right, we get this new D2. And what we're going to see then is that we have the exact same quantity supplied. So quantity supplied has not changed, but we have a higher price. So we have a big increase in price there. And that's what happens with demand. One final thing to note in that, if the MRP. So if MRP increases, remember we talked about this in yesterday's video, marginal revenue productivity. So if marginal revenue productivity increases for land, so for example, when we see a particular patch of land in Dublin, and when we see that the prices of houses are increasing and increasing and increasing, then the marginal revenue productivity for housing will increase, which will further increase the demand for land.